It was a cloudy Sunday afternoon in San Francisco, the kind that made people crave warm meals and quiet company. Sundar Pichai, dressed in a simple gray hoodie and worn jeans, walked down a cobbled alley near Union Square. He looked like any other tired soul needing a break. His face, calm but thoughtful, didn't betray his identity. To the average passerby, he was just another man trying to escape the buzz of Silicon Valley for a moment of peace. No guards, no assistants, no entourage, just a man, a hoodie, and a rumbling stomach. He spotted a small, vintage-looking restaurant tucked between two boutiques. The place had charm: rustic wood panels, vines curling up the windows, and a chalkboard menu that promised hot soup and hand-baked bread. It was the kind of place that spoke of comfort. As Sundar stepped in, the warmth of the space wrapped around him. Old jazz played softly in the background. A few couples chatted over coffee. An elderly man read the paper in the corner, and a young waiter stood behind the counter, wiping glasses with robotic precision. Sundar approached with a polite nod and said quietly, "Table for one, please." The waiter didn't smile. He glanced at Sundar's clothes, then at his unshaven face. "Sorry, sir," he said flatly. "We're full." Sundar blinked. The restaurant was half empty. He looked around, confused but calm. "I don't mind waiting," he offered gently. The waiter's tone hardened. "We have a dress code." Sundar looked down at himself, suddenly self-aware. It wasn't that he'd dressed poorly, just simply a hoodie, jeans, old sneakers. Nothing offensive. "Ah, okay," he replied, his voice softening rather than rising. "I didn't know." The waiter shrugged and turned away, wiping another glass. Sundar stood there for a moment. Not angry, not offended, just quiet. The way someone might be after realizing they don't belong somewhere, even if they hadn't done anything wrong. He turned to leave without protest. The bell above the door jingled softly behind him. Outside, the clouds had darkened. It was about to rain. He walked a block in silence, the kind of silence that echoes inside more than outside. In that moment, he wasn't the CEO of one of the most powerful companies on earth. He wasn't the man who stood on stages and shaped the future. He was just someone told, without words, that he didn't matter. He found a bench near a bookstore and sat down, letting the cold wind sting his face. A part of him wondered how many people were turned away just like that every day. Not because they did anything wrong, but because someone else decided they weren't good enough. The thought stayed with him. It didn't feel fair. Not for him, and not for the hundreds of invisible faces behind his memory. Immigrants, students, dreamers. Anyone who'd been told, "Not here, not you, not now." A young woman walked by, struggling with a box full of books. It slipped from her hands and crashed onto the pavement. Pages scattered like frightened birds. Sundar didn't think twice. He rose, hurried to her, and began gathering the books, brushing off dirt and handing them back with a small smile. "Thank you," she said, breathless. "Most people just walk by." "Sometimes," he replied. "People forget how heavy things can be." She paused, recognizing something in him, though she couldn't place it. "You're really kind." He just nodded. Kindness doesn't cost anything. As she left, Sundar's phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from his assistant. Reminder, tonight's Tech for Change gala. Speaking slot at 7 p.m. He smiled faintly. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to give a speech about inclusion, technology, and humanity, after being quietly excluded himself just an hour earlier. And yet he wasn't bitter. Not really. Instead, he felt a new clarity settle over him. At 6:50 p.m., Sundar stood backstage at the gala. The lights were bright, the crowd enormous. Suits, ties, designer shoes, flashing. Cameras. He wore the same hoodie and jeans. Someone backstage whispered, "Do you want a jacket? We have a spare." He shook his head. "No, I'm fine like this." When he stepped onto the stage, applause erupted, but his face remained solemn. He waited for silence. Then he began. "Today, I was turned away from a restaurant. Not because of what I said or did, but because of what I wore, because of what someone thought I looked like. It was a small moment, a simple rejection, but it reminded me of something important. The audience was silent now. You could hear hearts shift in their chests. He continued, his voice steady. Technology may connect us, but respect keeps us together. And respect should never depend on how someone looks, or where they're from, or what they wear. He didn't say the restaurant's name. He didn't shame. He simply told the story, not as a man of power, but as a man who'd been reminded how it feels to be small. As he finished, people rose to their feet, not out of habit, but out of emotion. But just as he stepped off the stage, something unexpected happened. A man rushed up to him, pale and sweating. It was the waiter from the restaurant. "Sir, I didn't know. I just saw the speech. I'm so sorry." And Sundar paused, looked into the man's eyes, and the room behind the stage was filled with congratulations and flashes of cameras. But Sundar wasn't looking at any of it. His eyes were on the man standing in front of him, the same waiter, who had told him to leave just hours ago. The man's hands were shaking, his breath shallow, as if he'd run all the way from the restaurant to this gala. He looked smaller now, not in size, but in spirit. Regret sat heavy on his shoulders like soaked cloth. "Sir, I made a mistake," the waiter stammered, eyes not quite meeting Sundar's. "I didn't know who you were." Sundar looked at him for a long, still moment. The air between them was thick. But Sundar didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for an apology. Instead, he said something that made everyone in the room stop pretending to check their phones. "That's the problem," Sundar said softly. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect." The waiter's lips parted, but no words came out. His face flushed with shame. Sundar placed a hand on the man's shoulder, not to intimidate, but to steady. "I wasn't upset because you didn't recognize me. I was disappointed because I realized how many people might get turned away, not just from restaurants, but from opportunity. And they'll never have a stage to talk about it." The waiter stood there, unsure whether to cry or thank him. Sundar didn't wait for either. He gave a small nod and turned away, his message delivered, not through microphones, but through compassion. And just like that, the moment passed. Later that night, as the gala wound down and the city lights blinked like distant stars, Sundar found himself walking alone again. No guards, no car waiting. He liked it this way. There was clarity in solitude, like breathing cold air after a long day indoors. He walked past the same alley, past the same restaurant. It was closed now. Chairs flipped on tables, the chalkboard wiped clean. But he paused outside the window and saw his own reflection staring back at him. Not the CEO, not the speaker, just the man who'd been told he wasn't welcome. He remembered something his mother used to say in Tamil when he was growing up in Chennai. The way someone treats you when they don't need you tells you who they are. He took out his phone and typed a message, not to a colleague, but to a former classmate back in India who had messaged him weeks ago asking for advice on applying to universities. Sundar hadn't responded, not because he didn't care, but because life had gotten loud. Now, in the quiet, he replied. It felt right. The next day, the story of his speech had gone viral. But it wasn't the speech people were sharing. It was the moment. The moment when he forgave the waiter. The moment when power chose patience over pride. Videos were clipped, hashtags trended, and journalists wrote headlines that felt more like fables than facts. But Sundar stayed quiet. He didn't tweet, he didn't do interviews. He just went back to work. A week passed, then two. And something strange began to happen. Letters started arriving, not emails. Real letters, thick envelopes with trembling handwriting. A single mother in Ohio who'd been judged for her tattoos wrote, I showed your speech to my daughter. Now she knows being kind is more important than being pretty. A retired Navy vet from Atlanta who'd been turned away from jobs for being too old wrote, You reminded me that I still matter. A kid from Nepal sent a sketch of Sundar in his hoodie, standing on stage with the words, Your silence speaks louder than their noise. And somewhere in those letters, an idea started to grow. Not a corporate idea, not a business pitch. Something softer. Something closer to the chest. Sundar called a small team into his office one evening. The walls were covered with whiteboards, the table littered with coffee cups and old prototypes. He looked at them, these engineers and thinkers, and said something that made their eyes widen. What if we built something to amplify quiet voices? A platform not for influencers or brands, but for real people with real stories who get overlooked. They didn't ask for a budget or a deadline. They just nodded. Because in that moment, they weren't employees. They were believers. But not everyone believed. A week into the project, Sundar got a call. Not from a stranger, from someone close, someone he respected. The voice on the other end was calm but cold. "This isn't what we do," the voice said. "You're risking our brand. Helping strangers tell stories won't increase profits." Sundar didn't respond right away. He looked out the window where the city stretched like a sleeping giant. Then, in the same calm voice he'd used with the waiter, he said, "Maybe it won't increase profits, but it might increase purpose." There was a pause. Then the line went dead. Sundar leaned back in his chair, feeling something stir inside him. A tension he hadn't felt in years, the kind that comes before a storm. Not outside, inside. And as night fell over the city, he knew something big was coming. Not a headline, not a scandal. Something deeper. Because when you challenge the system notices. And somewhere, in a boardroom lit by neon reflections and silent judgments, a decision was being made, one that would change everything. The days that followed felt different, like the air around Sundar had changed its rhythm. Not faster or slower, just heavier, the kind of weight that doesn't press on your shoulders but lives behind your ribs. He carried it into every meeting, every call, every room that echoed with the sound of keyboards and calculated ambition. While the company hummed with usual metrics, clicks, shares, revenues, Sundar kept thinking about the letters. Those fragile envelopes that held the raw honesty most algorithms couldn't measure. The project, still unnamed, began to take shape. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't sleek, but it was real. They built something small and quiet, almost like a digital campfire. People could record stories, post thoughts, share moments without filters, without likes, without chasing the approval of strangers. No ads, no fame machine, just voices. Honest ones. But honesty doesn't sit well in rooms that run on numbers. One morning, just as the fog lifted over the bay, Sundar was called into a private meeting. He walked in and instantly felt it. The room was too clean, too quiet, like a courtroom pretending to be a conference room. Around the long glass table sat 4 board members, serious faces, starched suits. They didn't look up when he entered. One of them tapped a pen slowly like a metronome counting down to something unpleasant. "We've reviewed the resources going into this storytelling experiment," said the man at the head of the table. He didn't say it with curiosity. He said it like the word itself left a bitter taste. "It's not aligned with our strategic goals, it's emotional, unpredictable, and it's making shareholders nervous." Sundar sat quietly. He wasn't surprised, just disappointed. It was always the same story. Emotion was a risk unless it sold something. "We think it's best if the project is paused," another voice added, "or quietly phased out. There are more measurable priorities." For a moment, Sundar didn't speak. He looked at the faces around him. He had once trusted them. Now they looked like furniture, well-made, unmoving, and built to last without changing shape. Then he leaned forward slightly. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost too calm. "The people using it don't want to be measured. They want to be heard." One of the board members scoffed. "That's idealistic." Sundar nodded. "Maybe. But idealism built this company. Remember that?" The room went still. No one answered. After the meeting, he walked back to his office with a strange sense of clarity. Not the kind that comes from being right, but the kind that comes from finally seeing the line in the sand, and realizing you've already stepped over it. He opened his laptop and began drafting a letter. Not a resignation. Not yet. Something else. Something more personal. To the person who feels invisible, I see you. You matter. Your story is not too small, and I will make sure someone hears it, even if I have to build that place myself. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. He posted it quietly on the project's homepage. By morning, it had been read over 2 million times. Not shared, not trending. Just read, carefully, deeply, silently. And then the calls began. Not from press or politicians, but from people. A nurse in Delhi who had been ignored for speaking up about patient care. A teacher in Minnesota fired for challenging outdated textbooks. A boy in Cairo who had coded his way out of poverty and wanted to teach others how. They didn't want money. They wanted space. Space to exist without having to prove their worth. Sundar listened. He always listened. And the more he listened, the more he realized something was changing. Not just outside the company, inside it too. His team, once cautious, now fearless, had begun sneaking more time into the project, building new features after hours, defending it in meetings, whispering words like dignity and empathy into rooms that usually only spoke in quarterly projections. They weren't following orders. They were following belief, but not everyone was inspired. Anonymous complaints began circling. Phrases like misuse of company resources and conflict of mission started appearing in internal memos. An internal audit was announced. And then one morning, security arrived at Sundar's office door with a sealed envelope. He opened it slowly. Inside was a notice of investigation. Not a punishment, but a warning. It was the company's polite way of saying, "Stop." Sundar sat there for a long time, alone, watching dust float through a sunbeam. The kind of silence that makes you question everything. Was it worth it? This push against the machine? This quiet rebellion dressed as kindness? Then he heard a knock. Not from security. Not from press. It was a janitor. A woman he passed every day but had never really spoken to. She looked nervous but determined. She held out a small piece of paper. No envelope, no formality. He opened it. "I saw what you did. Thank you. My daughter posted her first story yesterday. She thinks her voice matters now. So do I." And for Sundar, that was it. Proof. Not in data, but in people. He smiled for the first time in days. Not because the fight was over, but because it had finally begun. For the first time in years, Sundar felt like he wasn't managing a company. He was defending a belief. Each day brought fresh tension, not loud or dramatic, but the kind that moved beneath the surface like deep ocean currents. His days were filled with the usual spreadsheets, timelines, and meetings, but everything felt off. People spoke in polished sentences, but their eyes flickered with doubt. Hallways that once echoed with curiosity now hummed with silence. Something was shifting, and he could feel it. The internal investigation was quiet, polite, and sharp. It didn't accuse, just observed. Emails were reviewed, calendar logs pulled. One by one, members of his small team were interviewed in glass rooms where trust had no place to sit. No one said the word punishment, but it lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Despite that, the team held together. No one backed away from the project. In fact, they leaned into it harder. When something is born from belief, pressure doesn't destroy it. It hardens it. Sundar didn't fight the investigation. He welcomed it. He answered every question, showed every receipt, explained every decision, and when they asked him why he didn't get board approval before launching the storytelling platform, he replied simply, "Because the board would have said no." They blinked, expecting strategy. They got honesty. Still, the pressure mounted. What began as a whisper campaign was now a subtle siege. Invites to certain meetings stopped coming. Press requests were rerouted. Projects he used to approve were now under review, and through it all, he remained still, not passive, just rooted, not defensive, just unshakable, like a tree in wind that refuses to fall because its roots go deeper than anyone thought. Then, without warning, a new headline dropped. CEO funds unauthorized platform, internal revolt or visionary move. It spread fast, faster than the story of the restaurant, faster than the gala speech. Blogs speculated, experts weighed in, and social media lit up with two sides, those calling him reckless and those calling him revolutionary. And while the ECI, internet raged, Sundar sat in his office watching the rain beat against the window. He wasn't worried about the noise outside. He was waiting for the noise inside. And it came. His phone buzzed. A private meeting. No agenda. No location listed. Just a time. 8 p.m. He knew what that meant. That night, he was led through a side entrance of the headquarters to a small room he'd never seen before. It was cold, not in temperature, but in tone. The table was short, the chairs low, as if designed to remove any illusion of comfort. Across from him sat 3 men and 1 woman, board executives, powerful, polished, and silent. "We're giving you a choice," one of them finally said, adjusting his cufflinks without looking up. "You can step down quietly. We'll protect your reputation. Or you can stay and face a vote of no confidence, which you will lose." Sundar said nothing for a moment. Not because he was afraid, but because he was tired. Tired of people confusing silence with weakness. Tired of believing that kindness had to hide behind strategy. He leaned forward, his voice calm and without anger. "You think this is about me? It's not, it never was. It's about every person who's been silenced, dismissed, or told they don't belong. If you're uncomfortable now, imagine living your whole life feeling like that." They didn't respond. They didn't need to. Their silence wasn't confusion, it was calculation. When Sundar left the room, he knew. The decision had already been made. Not in that moment, but long before, back when he first chose people over profit. He walked out of the building and into the night, the wind pressing against his hoodie like a warning. He didn't go home. Instead, he took a cab across the city to a small neighborhood near Mission Street. He stepped into a community center where the walls were peeling and the lights flickered. Waiting for him were 10 strangers. Immigrants, students, veterans, parents. They had found his platform. They had told their stories. And tonight, they wanted to meet the man who believed in them when no one else did. They didn't ask about the headlines. They didn't care about the vote. They told him how it felt to speak without fear, how it felt to be heard. A young man, barely 20, stood up and said, "No one's ever looked at me the way you looked at that waiter, like I mattered." And Sundar felt something swell in his chest, not pride, not defiance. Something else. Home, not the kind built with walls, the kind built with connection. That night he sat with them for hours. No cameras, no speeches, just stories shared over lukewarm tea and cracked plastic chairs. And in that dimly lit room, something became clear. They could take his title. They could erase his access. But they couldn't take the thing he had already built. Not a platform. Not a product. A movement. The next morning, he arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The lobby was empty, the city still yawning into the day. He stepped into his office one last time. It smelled like paper and memories. He opened his laptop and wrote a short message. "I've spent years building systems that shape the world, but today I'm stepping aside to build something that listens to it instead, not because I was forced to, but because I was finally ready." He hit send. Then quietly, he left the building, and outside, just beyond the glass doors, something waited for him. Not a car, not a camera, something unexpected, something that would change everything again. Outside the building, the morning light hadn't fully arrived. The sky was painted in that deep shade of gray that makes you unsure if the sun will show up at all. Sundar stood alone, the automatic glass doors sliding shut behind him with a hiss that sounded almost like a farewell. No one followed. No alarms. No public statement. The end of an era passed like a whisper, but as he stepped onto the sidewalk, something stirred. At first, he thought it was just another early commuter waiting at the corner. But then he saw her. She stood holding a folded sign, not shouting, not marching, just holding it. The paper trembled slightly in the breeze, and her eyes locked with his as if she'd been waiting all night. He recognized her instantly. Not her name, her story. She was the woman who had written him a letter months ago, the single mother from Ohio who'd shown his speech to her daughter. The one who had been denied a job because of how she looked, how she spoke, how she didn't fit. Her sign said only one thing: "Thank you for seeing people like me." Sundar walked over slowly. No words. Just the soft, stunned kind of silence that lives between two people who've never met, but somehow understand each other completely. She reached into her coat and handed him something, a worn-out paperback, its spine taped, its cover faded. "This belonged to my father," she said. "He never got to tell his story, but you made sure I could." Sundar held the book with both hands, as if it were fragile enough to shatter. He didn't know what to say, so he simply bowed his head. Gratitude has a way of making even the most articulate person silent. And then, something strange happened. Behind her, more people began arriving, slowly, without fanfare. A teacher with tired eyes, a street musician carrying a broken guitar, a child holding his grandmother's hand. None of them carried signs. They didn't need to. Their presence was the message. They had all come for one reason: not to protest, not to celebrate, to witness, to stand in quiet solidarity with the man who had reminded them they mattered. It wasn't a crowd. It was a presence, like a low hum that grew warmer the longer it lasted. Sundar looked around at the faces, some curious, some emotional, some holding back tears, and felt something deep stir within him. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. He didn't go home. Instead, he walked with them, through side streets and alleyways, past cafes and train stops, until they reached a small, worn-down building, nestled between a laundromat and an old bakery. It used to be a non-profit. Now it was just dust and old dreams. He stared at it for a long time, and then he whispered, "This will do." Within a week, the space was cleaned. Within 2, it had power. By the 3rd week, it had a name: Voice House. No logo, no brand launch, just a room where people could come in, sit down, and tell their story. No judgment, no audience required. They could write, speak, whisper, cry, whatever they needed to do to let the weight go. Word spread fast, not through marketing, but through mouths and hearts. The space filled with voices, not polished ones, not famous ones, just true ones. People came from all over: single parents, veterans, immigrants, students, survivors. Each story different, each one a thread in something far bigger than a platform. And Sundar, he sat among them, not above, not outside, among. He took notes, he asked questions, he listened like the world depended on it, and slowly, something remarkable began to happen. People didn't just come to share, they came to heal. A woman stood one afternoon, voice shaking, and admitted she had never said her son's name out loud since he passed. A teenager came in with her face half hidden by a hoodie, and left 2 hours later with her story pinned proudly to the wall. A man who hadn't spoken in 3 years recorded a message to his estranged daughter and, with trembling hands, sent it. And through it all, Sundar stayed silent. Not because he had nothing to say, because the moment belonged to others now. But as word of Voice House spread, it began to reach places Sundar had hoped it never would. Corporate boardrooms, influencer agencies, media platforms sniffing for the next emotional angle. Offers started flooding in. Partnerships, investments, brand integrations. People wanted to buy the voice of the unheard, and Sundar refused. Again and again, politely, firmly. But then came a knock on the door of Voice House one rainy afternoon. A man in a sharp coat stood outside holding an umbrella and a briefcase. He said he wasn't there to offer a deal. He was there with a warning. "They're going to try and shut you down," he said. "Not because it's illegal, because it's inconvenient." Sundar looked at him, calm but curious. "For who?" The man smiled faintly. "For everyone who's made a fortune from people staying silent." And just like that, Sundar understood. He wasn't just running a space anymore. He was holding up a mirror, and some people didn't like what they saw. The storm was coming. Not a metaphorical one this time, a real, coordinated one. And Sundar had a choice to make. Stay quiet and protect what he'd built quietly, or raise his voice and risk everything. When Sundar stepped out of the building that morning, it was like the world had pressed pause. The sky hung heavy with clouds that looked too tired to rain, the city still rubbing sleep from its eyes. No cameras waited, no reporters, not even a curious glance from a passing stranger. It was the kind of silence you feel after something big breaks. But before anyone realizes it's broken, Sundar took a breath, slow and steady, and stepped onto the sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on his back and an idea still burning quietly in his chest. He didn't go home. He walked. For hours. Down streets he hadn't visited in years. Past bookstores where he once browsed unnoticed. Past street musicians playing half-forgotten songs. He wasn't searching for something. He was walking off the weight of years spent carrying the hopes of millions while quietly managing the expectations of a billion-dollar boardroom that measured success only in metrics. He eventually stopped in front of a small building that had once been a community print shop. The paint was cracked. The windows were dusty. But something about it whispered, "Here. This. Now." And that whisper turned into a movement. He bought the space quietly, made no announcement. There was no ribbon cutting, no tweets, no photo ops, just a handwritten sign on the door that said, "Voice House. Come in, tell your story. No one's judging." It started with one woman. She walked in on a Tuesday. She was carrying a folded piece of notebook paper and a look that said she hadn't trusted anyone in years. Sundar greeted her with nothing but a chair and his attention. She read her story. It was about losing a job, losing a home, nearly losing herself. She cried halfway through. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, she looked up and said, "I feel lighter." And that's when Sundar knew. It wasn't about changing the system anymore. It was about changing the people who'd been broken by it. Day by day, Voice House grew, not in scale, but in depth. A former nurse came in and spoke about burnout. A college dropout shared a letter she'd never sent to her father. A little boy with a stutter whispered his dreams into a microphone and smiled when Sundar told him he had the voice of a lion. No branding, no filters, no sponsorships, just truth, shared in its most human form. And still, the outside world noticed. Offers came. Platforms wanted to buy the idea. Tech firms wanted to scale the model. Media companies called it the next big wave. Sundar declined them all with the same quiet conviction that had carried him out of the corporate tower. But not everyone liked what was happening. One night he found a letter slipped under the door. No return address, just 5 words scribbled in bold ink. "This place makes people think." He understood what it meant. Not just the message, the fear behind it. In a world where noise keeps people distracted, a space for reflection becomes dangerous. Truth has a way of threatening systems built on silence. He considered closing it down just for a second, not out of fear, but protection. The people coming here bearing their wounds and hopes deserved safety. But then something happened. An old man in a worn cap walked in. He didn't speak, just handed Sundar a cassette tape. "Recorded this 30 years ago," he said, voice trembling. Never had the courage to play it. Sundar sat with him, clicked play, and together they listened to a younger voice, broken but brave, telling the story of a war, a lost friend, a love letter never sent. When it ended, the man cried. Not from sadness, from release. "I think," he whispered, "this is what peace feels like." And that was it. Voice House would stay, because it was never just a building. It was proof that empathy could be infrastructure, that compassion could be louder than profit, and that even the softest voice could leave a mark louder than applause. Months passed. Sundar no longer appeared on magazine covers. He no longer opened tech summits. And still, people came. More and more. Not because they knew his name, but because they'd heard there was a place where their names mattered. One afternoon, a child came in holding her mother's hand. She looked up at Sundar and asked, "Are you the man who helped people speak?" He smiled and kneeled down. "No," he said gently. "I just made sure someone was listening." Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, and inside, Sundar sat beside a new visitor, pen in hand, heart open, still listening, still learning, still building something the world didn't know it needed, not with code, not with capital, with care.